All right. Yeah, so we're going to get started. Thanks for having me, Sasha. Today we're going to look at the Marko framework. It's a JavaScript framework for building UIs, like many other JavaScript frameworks. But it also has a few really unique qualities, and I'm really excited to show off today what that means. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, my goal is going to be introduce you to the Marko framework. So I'm going to look at a bit of first why Marko exists and how it came to be. Then we'll look a bit at the basics, syntax, etc. And then finally, we're going to build a simple functioning site. This intro part, the slides here are only about 15 minutes, but it's a good kind of overview to kind of get an idea of what's going on and why we're doing this. So right off the bat, this is the question, right? I'm going to spend 10 minutes explaining Marko's reason for being and give a bit about the history. I know there are a lot of other options, so we need to start here, but there's so much cool stuff I want to show off. My hope is by the end of this, you're at least interested to see what Marko can do for you. So yeah, Marko's origins actually go back as far as 2012, 2013 time period. It's actually one of the older JavaScript frameworks. They're still being actively developed today. It was created at eBay basically around the same time Facebook was creating React. And most modern JavaScript frameworks have kind of evolved from React's mold, but Marko was something completely different, really. It was kind of clear, if you go back in time even further, from the mid-2000s, that JavaScript was going to be the future for cross-platform portability. The web had expanded and JavaScript was starting to find its way into really everything. But at the same time, the industry saw an increased usage, retention around mobile applications, like native mobile applications on iOS and Android. And there was a real big push to kind of get that sort of experience on the web. And Marko, interestingly enough, had completely different goals. eBay had completely different goals. More than anything, just wanted to move from the full stack, from like their Java backend for rendering templates to like a full stack JavaScript solution without losing any performance. eBay has crazy measurements on every single page that, like, if there's any regression, it's no-go. And that exploration really started with templating languages like Dust. There were certain qualities that we wanted out of a JavaScript framework. Most importantly, we wanted to be able to stream our responses, so we weren't being held up by any data latency. And then secondly, which was also really important for us, was making sure that to get that page load was we had to keep a tab on how much JavaScript we're sending to the page. When we're dealing with SEO, basically people come to your site from search engines often, right? And the ranking, right? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, you can kind of already see on the right, this chart here that we're looking at it's one of many studies, but it was just showing that how much users drop off based on how long it takes to load the page, essentially. And you can see that once you get past 3 or 4 seconds, like the drop off can be significant. Once you get up to 7 or 8 seconds, it looks like no one cares anymore and they just stay there. Most people stay there the whole duration, around 60-some-odd%. But generally, that first few seconds has a huge potential of drop off. And we've seen this, across several studies. And at the same time, the little chart I have on the left here is actually from Adi Osmani from the Chrome team, who gathered stats for the image on the left, and he actually kind of recommended that we should do no larger than 100 kilobytes for our main JavaScript bundle. And I don't think that's a bad guideline in general, but he wasn't really talking about e-commerce, right? Because if you combine these two, right, and you look at that bounce rate, you really don't want to get much over 3 seconds. Somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds, you're getting from 11 to 25, 24, 25%. Like, it's a significant drop off. And essentially, if you do a little math here, if you want to get that time to interactive down to 3 seconds, this is linear, it's imperfect. You have to basically divide those numbers by 5, right? You end up with 3 seconds interactive and load and basically 70 kilobytes of JavaScript. So in any case, yes, what I was saying is a better guideline might be more like 70 kilobytes. If you want to have good performance on, even the slowest of mobile devices, and networks. And I mean, to emphasize this even further from the same article series from the Chrome team, essentially, they kind of showed that bytes in JavaScript weren't equal to bytes in other assets like JPEGs. Like, sure, over the network might be the same, it might be what, 3.4 seconds in this example over a 3G network, but the actual time to parse, compile, and execute the JavaScript on this low-end device, I think it was a Moto 4G or Moto 4, rather, is significant. It only takes about 100 milliseconds to decode and rasterize that image, but it's taking another 3.5 seconds to parse and execute this JavaScript. That's like double the network time. And if you ignore the network, it's 30 times or 35 times more expensive to do the JavaScript. Obviously, browser vendors have been optimizing on this the last couple of years. The lowest median device, it goes up over time. We get better capabilities, better networks and whatnot. But I just want to kind of point this out that, like, even today, the Moto 4 seems to be like the gold standard for low-end devices for these kind of tests. And these numbers are from real sites and real numbers, like basically collected stats from all over, from the top sites, and basically compiled this list for their study. So this does have an impact. The size of your JavaScript is important. We do want to kind of aim ideally for, that initial chunk bundle to be around 70 kilobytes. It does make a difference to devices, and for a global company like eBay, this is really important. So let's look at this another way, right? Because I'm telling you about restrictions. If you look at any website and you kind of go, like, what is dynamic? Like, look, this is a product page, some kind of fictional product page, but what parts of the page actually update, right? We can start, by maybe we click and add to cart, and that updates a number in the corner. We now have an item in a cart. Maybe we can click on the cart button and it can pop up a modal if we wish to continue to checkout, these kind of things. But most of this page, like for its duration here, will never change. So how do we leverage this information? That's really the thinking where this comes from. And the solution is kind of simple, since we've always had it. I mean, might not be a revelation, but multi-page apps, yeah. Multi-page apps, in contrast to what we call single-page apps, like you build popular frameworks with React. I'm talking, server routed round trips. Basically, the way the web always worked. In general, MPAs, or multi-page apps, have been put under a bit more of a bad light the last several years, and that's because mostly this desire to create these mobile-like experiences. But not every site is an app. And there are advantages to using the tools that are built into the browser. There's trade-offs too. Page transitions can be not as slick, but I think a lot of the perception here has actually changed a lot over the last several years. Like the old kind of vision of the page white flickering and stuff isn't really the way modern browsers work. When you click to a new navigation, it actually holds the previous page and then starts the process in the background until it receives what it can render, and then it swaps it. Interestingly enough, features like React Suspense are actually based off emulating this native browser behavior. But more importantly, for us here, obviously, this is a kind of surefire way to have the means to achieve our goal of these incredible page speeds and performance. So let's look at this again. I asked, what's truly dynamic? See, if this was a single page app, most of this page would be, right? Because everything below the top header would need to be able to be rendered again on navigation. You do some kind of client-side routing. But if we're thinking multi-page app, a lot of this stuff never needs to re-render, right? Like, how about the item on the page, right? If we're doing some kind of async call in the browser, we wouldn't have needed to wait for it to load before rendering it in the client and require like all the JavaScript code to actually render this. But if for server rendering, then we don't need that code. And similarly, like if our navigations are just linking to new pages, we don't need the code for client-side router. We don't need special link components. Basically, in the end, by removing both the navigation and the async data loading, most of this page is static. So why would we ship any JavaScript to the browser for any of the other components? Content that you don't interact with, that doesn't update the page, never needs to re-render in the browser. Knowing this, we don't need as much component code, as I was saying, but we also don't need to serialize all of the data to display that code. So, if it's not interactive, that those components don't update, then we don't actually need to send the data. Most server rendering involves sending both the HTML, which is realized, including like all the encoded data into your view, and sending a big blob of JSON. By doing this, we actually only need the data that's sent in as like the input props to our interactive components. The rest of it never needs to get sent to the browser. This also kind of lessens a lot of the stress on like client-side caches. So like essentially, your query libraries and that, again, less JavaScript. It's just kind of a different mentality. And since there's less code to execute or send, and there's just less code to execute, the performance gains are actually just fairly straightforward. We did some internal testing at eBay a couple of years ago for the core page rendering. Keep in mind, if you go to ebay.com right now, you're going to see a whole bunch of lazy loading and after script ready stuff where like the page continues to load, it feels like, for like half a second, even on a fast connection, because so much ads and stuff comes in after the fact. But we can measure independently that initial page load experience where we draw what we call the critical content. And we found that this approach of partially hydrating, it's called, could reduce page loads anywhere from 60 to 90%, depending on how interactive the page was. This is a huge savings. I mean, we believe we can still do better here, and we're working on that, but this is a significant performance improvement. And most interestingly, it's done completely automatically by the Marko compiler. And if you want to kind of see what I'm talking about, if you look at this chart below, this one's a little confusing because there's gzip and minified numbers, but it's just for comparison. Essentially, the component level is this partial hydration that we have today, and then full page is kind of what you'd have maybe in a typical app where you're doing the full page. We just turn the partial hydration off. So this is less than a science per se, because like there's inclusion. Like the apps are written expecting partial hydration, so there might be inclusions of certain libraries that might not have otherwise been there. But then when you consider that the client-side architectures have their own set of libraries, as I mentioned, like cache query libraries, client-side routing, data formatting, stuff like Moment, like when you consider all those things, I think it is roughly along the same sort of lines. So you can kind of see here that for something like eBay's homepage, which is fairly simplistic, the difference was like 439 gzipped to like 72 kilobytes, which is like an 84% size difference, and gets eBay's homepage down into that 70 kilobyte range that we want. Obviously, some of the other pages are more complicated, more involved. So, I mean, there's always places where we can improve and look at stuff, but just kind of give you a baseline how drastic a change something like partial hydration can make. And this is kind of just built right into Marko. Let's continue. So that's kind of a quick overview of why Marko and how it approaches the space. But now is a good time to kind of look at the fundamentals before getting to building our Marko application. So like, what is it like to work with Marko? And for that, it really starts with HTML. Marko templates are just HTML as a baseline. You can, go grab any code snippet off the internet, maybe something for Stack Overflow, and you can just maybe some output from a design program from your UX designers, and you can just copy and paste it and have it work immediately. You can like simply take the extension, the HTML extension, and change it to .marko, and you're on your way. But Marko has a few other things, right? And it lets you extend HTML with JavaScript expressions, built-in components, and custom components that you can alter yourself. These components are just defined by other .marko files, and Marko can detect them based on name, and folder structures. So without imports, you can use them in your templates, which makes for a really kind of slick, sort of cut and paste kind of development experience, because you're just adding tags to your page, and it just feels like you're using HTML. Keep in mind, Marko does add some syntax on top of HTML, rather than trying to overload existing HTML semantics. This is a unique choice for Marko. Basically, it wanted the language to be more analyzable. So instead of like using directives, you might have seen like a VIF or NG4 or whatever they use, Marko actually has dedicated syntax, kind of like JSX, to handle a lot of the more interesting cases, rather than trying to change the way attributes work semantically, because that's generally less analyzable. I'm going to introduce you to some of that syntax over the next couple slides, kind of get you familiar. We'll probably hit a few more throughout the course of this workshop, but just so that you can see it. So what does a Marko component look like? Well, Marko files are single file components similar to what you find in Vue or Svelte. They support blocks sort of that allow us to define functions, classes, and styles. To make a component stateful, we add a class here, and we can define state in there that updates. These classes have their own life cycles like this onCreate, and you can define things like event handlers like increment. Then when we update our state, we can just essentially interact with it and it will update the view. Like in our example, we have state.count in this div and we click it and essentially it updates. If classes aren't your thing, we do have a preview release on a new hook-like syntax that we're going to be coming out in the next version of Marko. You can actually try it today. But right now we're going to focus on building apps as you would today and the way the majority of the apps at eBay are built. There are a couple different syntaxes already in this example you're seeing. First of all, the text interpolation uses $signs, kind of like tag template literals for escaping. And the events are a little bit different in the syntax in that we pass the name of the event handler in and any arguments we want to pass to it with this kind of on dash event name. These are some details, but we will see a few more as we can continue on. The other really obvious one for people coming in is Marko uses tags for control flow. And this is what I mean by control flow, or rendering things like loops and conditionals. So like this if tag uses another new syntax we have here, which is basically passes a default or unnamed argument to the tag, which is what's in these parameters. Essentially, the behavior is kind of what you'd expect. If the condition is met, it shows what's inside the if. Otherwise, if not, it removes it. And we also support else if and else tags to produce some more complicated logic. The for tag iterates over lists, or actually really any iterable. To inject variables into the child context, similar to like a function callback, Marko uses something we call tag parameters. So you can see these pipes here. It's basically, you can picture these pipes basically being like a function callback into here. And again, this is a unique syntax, but it allows us to do a lot of stuff with an analysis a lot simpler, and it keeps it terse and compact. So basically, each iteration of this for loop has access to their copy of the variables, and they don't leak outside, kind of like as I said, a callback. Tag parameters can also be used in custom components, allowing for a level of composition that you often don't easily find in a lot of single file component frameworks. They usually involve a lot of attribute mangling and namespacing. This is kind of just very directed way of composing on this. Like with Marko, if you didn't want to use this for tag and wanted to use like a paginated list tag or some kind of custom component, you'd actually just use the exact same patterns and build upon this. The last tag that I want to show before we kind of get into the workshop is the await tag, which we use to handle asynchronous data. And we'll be using this a bunch today. Essentially, it uses, again, that default attribute or argument rather to pass in a promise. And then what happens is, based on the resolution of the promise, we can actually show some different states. And the way it does this, again, is another new syntax, which is we call tag attributes. And tag attributes are very much like name slots in Vue or Svelte, or render props in React, in that you can assign parts of the template to be rendered by the child component. In this case, it allows us to render the different in-flight states for our async data request. A placeholder while it's loading, and then the then where we can actually show the finished results. And you can see this is also using our tag parameters to pass that person scope in here. So this is the person that we load from the person promise. And finally, there's an error bound catch here, which will catch any errors that happen. Maybe the promise is rejected, and then display the appropriate things. So this is sort of one of the more complicated built-in tags, but it's probably the most powerful one, because this will give us our ability to handle all the async data loading, and it actually plays directly into Marko's ability to stream the content in as it's available. That is the high level of what we're going to do today, but I want to kind of get started here in a tutorial. Hopefully from that, you at least have an idea what Marko's about. And we're going to kind of switch gears a bit here, because this is my first time giving this workshop. I'm just going to put that right out there. And I'm hoping my explanations are clear, but if people have questions, I will be watching the chat. We can kind of address them as we go along with this tutorial. I just wanted to get that out of the way. So basically, yeah, don't hesitate to ask some questions here as we go, because I am myself still working on how to maybe best introduce some of these topics as we go. All right, so what I've done here is I've created a repo on GitHub that people can get to, and I don't know if it's already shared before, but I'm going to just throw it in the chat in case it's not. And this repo I set up to basically have 5 steps along the way for us learning how to build our project. And what we're building here is a very, very simple blog tutorial. I don't even think it's completely, what I'd want to function on my own if I was building a blog yet. This is very basic because I wanted to show just the basic mechanisms of what people could build on. Essentially, this example is a little bit more interesting for us than like a to-do MVC, which is just child, list, like browser list management. And it's a little bit more interesting than like a Hacker News demo, which is just listing content. We're actually going to have the ability to create new posts and use forms and progressive enhancement and client-only updates, and basically see all the different ways you can approach both viewing data and updating data in Marko. Yeah. If you want to kind of follow along, that's the best thing. Once you can basically at any point check out any of these branches as we go along. Yeah, they all have the same dependencies. So once you get the repo down, npm install, and you're good to go. And my approach I'm going to do today, we're going to play in each of the steps, but I am going to mostly jump between steps because most of the stuff is copying like large HTML files essentially. And the first few steps are fairly straightforward. We focus on a single file. Step 4 is definitely more involved. So for the reason of saving time, I'm going to jump to it and then more explain it. And then step 5, we'll just kind of make the last shift and explain how optimization works in Marko. But that's kind of overview of this. But this tutorial blog is actually it's built off our Marko Beat starter with Cloudflare workers. So it's pre-set up to be able to deploy directly to Cloudflare. There are a few details and things that need to get set up for KV storage, but we'll be using KV almost like a database for our purposes, and that's their key value store on Cloudflare. But we have a local in-memory version that we'll be using in our dev environment that kind of simulates it, and that's basically how we're going to get started here. So yeah, first step is clone down the repo, and we'll kind of dig into it. I'm going to not install the update. I'm going to open this up and get myself here on the step 1, which is the project shell, and we can get started from here. All right, let me open my VS Code. All right, I'm going to make my stuff a little bit larger. I believe I'm going to close some extra windows. Let's get here. Hopefully this is all visible to everyone.
Yep, looks good.
Yeah, cool. All right, so when you first download this project, you're gonna basically see, I'm gonna delete this. The kind of frame for a Wrangler TOML I'm not going to worry about the deployment part of this right away. That would be something as we get to the end if we need to. But we're going to start with essentially just the authoring experience, right? This is a Vite project, so it comes with a Vite config where we basically have our Marko set up, all kind of built in for you. There isn't a ton interesting top level here, so we'll just jump right into the source folder, which is where all our code is. The breakdown of this project essentially is that there's two entry points, one for the development and one for when we deploy to Cloudflare. And what I've done in this base step is I've essentially set up our worker. This is the Cloudflare specific code. Cloudflare uses workers very similar to actually service workers in terms of their API, where there's basically they add an event listener to fetch, and then you can handle whatever event that comes to them. And in our case, we'll either be returning assets from the KV, which is, as I said, it's doubling as our database and as our CDN, like our static assets, or this is their pattern, which is kind of interesting. If it fails here, define it in the CDN, we can actually do some dynamic stuff. So we actually use a router to find what information we need for our route, and then we render the appropriate page. And I'll show you how that works in a second. But essentially, the worker and the dev server, this one uses Vite, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time here just because we won't be actually adjusting these files throughout the whole project. But essentially, this is just almost like an Express server, kind of just a node server for in dev, where it handles the request, again, looks up the routes, and then calls our same handler again with a spoofed request this time. We're using web request and response formats, which are standard. Obviously, Node has their own. We mask this so that we can use the same request response format regardless of what platform that we deploy to. So this works great for Cloudflare, where it's built in, but we can also have it running in a Node environment like here, or maybe AWS Lambda or some other different deployment. So that this kind of parts can all built into our starter templates, like the Vite Cloudflare starter. For us, our app really begins at this router that I mentioned, which is great because Vite has this ability to it's called glob import, but you can essentially describe a pattern. And in our cases, this lets us use this pages folder as a file-based router. So we can basically stick any .marko files in this pages folder, and it's going to treat it like almost like a static HTML page, and it gets handled automatically. Again, we're not doing a ton of work here. Just know that this router is basically matching on a pattern and forgets it's returning our HTML content, and for streamed responses, and then for our posts, we can actually do some API stuff. So I'm going to show how this works a little bit more. But this is all the top level stuff. We won't really need to edit it for the sake of our blog, but we have it exposed in case people want to customize that logic. The rest of the folders in source are essentially what I mentioned about the pages folder, which is where we have like our page. So this index Marko is basically index.html for our purposes. We have a components folder where we can just put in any additional components we use. And then we have this data folder, which I used to bootstrap our data for the KV. And all I did was I stole some markdown from some articles that I've written about Marko in the past just to seed this. It's just some of my articles from Dev2. I just literally just grabbed the markdown and posted them. And then what we're doing is we're just using a Vite plugin to load markdown and then putting it into a data array that on the first time that the KV kicks off or the dev server kicks off, it just basically stores this in either the KV or the local memory. So this is just a little something extra that I added to be able to kind of seed our data. If you're using a Postgres database or some other kind of mechanism, I guess if you're using Cloudflare, you might be hosting the API on a different service or be looking at maybe some other technologies for cloud data distribution. There's some complexity, or for our sake, because I want to keep this demo simple, we're using KV for everything. And we can access KV from the storage object. In Cloudflare, this storage object is globally available, so we can use it anywhere. And in our dev environment, we completely just monkey patch it onto global this. So essentially, this is kind of like the baseline for our data handling. And I put this all in step one because through the course of actually learning Marko, we don't really need to touch this. This is just all the bootstrapping that kind of goes in. We just added basically this data KV thing on top of our base Vite Cloudflare templates for us to be all set. So that's kind of the baseline starting point. I know it's a little bit much at first, but this is all provided for you just through this base config. So I wanted to really focus on this tutorial and how to actually author with Marko. So we're going to start with our first Marko page, essentially. And this component already has a couple things going on. Like we could have just started and, actually I am just going to start this way. Let's just make an H1 here, and I'll kind of show you. This is the most basic experience for Marko, right? You just have a file and you can just put some markup in it. And I'm just going to go npm run dev. That's how you start the dev server in Vite. And I'm going to just go here, and unsurprisingly, we have our hello page. But we want to do a little bit more here. And what the base template actually shows is that I've added a main element, and Marko has this shorthand for classes. You might have seen it before in some older server templating languages, things like Pug, where you can do like dot something to put static classes on, or hashtag something that use IDs. And essentially we have our main element, we have our H1 now wrapping it, and we have this layout component. This is a custom component, and you saw it earlier here, right? We find it because it's called layout and it's in our components directory. And the reason I pulled right off the start for this example to show a layout component is because this is a super common pattern in Marko, because you might have been wondering, well, where's the HTML? Well, in our case, we want to share this across all our components. Yeah, no import is needed here. The way this works in Marko is that at least within our app and we search for component folders, and there's actually a hierarchy to it. Like top level component folders can be seen anywhere. Nested component folders can only be seen from parents, but components also have like modules also have a way for discovery, where we have like a tags.json, I believe it's called. And we can use that in our like published modules as a way to also discover components. So there's a config format for that, but generally speaking, the components are automatically discovered. And yeah, so we have a style block. There's some styles that are on all pages, and then essentially, our HTML or head. And this is probably the I realize it's a bit of a syntax overload at first, but this is another one for us. This is how you do dynamic tags, essentially. What you'll find is part of the reason that Marko has the syntax is it has almost equivalent functionality to something like JSX. It doesn't want you to escape into JavaScript all the time because of being harder to analyze, but the feature set's almost one for one. So this is like how you'd be able to like change dynamically what component you have, and we use it for also our insertion of children, essentially. And in Marko, we call this a render body, because it's a little bit different than children, right? Children are actually realized virtual DOM nodes, and I'm getting a little technical here, where render body is almost like a function that gets called at this point, if that's the way of doing it. It's created at the point of this insertion. But so just simpler mental model here is it's not .children, it's .render body. But this is how you would insert kind of the children. So when we have our page that passes in this between the layout tags, it gets inserted here. Oh, Yeah, good point about Node 16. Yeah, it's some of these new streaming libraries and web response request objects. Node they're just getting added now to Node 16, which is nice. And in the future, they're going to be like actually core for support. But Node 14 is missing some stuff they need. This is kind of a shift that we're watching happening, where Node is trying to get more in line with web standards, so we can build more universal platforms. But yes, good point. I forgot the Node 16 requirement. Thanks. All right, so yeah, yeah, that's a really good note, and I should mention that and put that somewhere. Anyway, yeah, so basically you can kind of see how we now have our layout, and we insert our content in the page, and when we go over here, HMR refreshed us in the background, and we now have essentially our simple layout structure here. And you'll notice over the course of this blog, if you're a Dan Abramoff fan, the style of this blog was inspired by his overreacted blog. And we're doing a very terrible version of it, but that's kind of the basis of this. And you can kind of see that all our contents here that we had from the layout component, and then in the body, our main page has been inserted into here. Okay, so this is sort of the baseline for where we're going to get started today. So now that we've kind of done our hello world, the next, actually, I'm going to showcase one more thing before we move on. I wanted to mention this before, but we can just add any route we want here. And, again, we can just reuse our layout. This is, oh, sorry. And, I love H1s. We can just put whatever content we want in here. And if everything went well with Vite and updating, we should be able to just go to about and have this work. Although, oh yeah, it's because I don't have any container classes on this page. That's fine. But essentially, this is the experience. You just put in a new file, and then it becomes a new URL. So just want to kind of show that in terms of the file-based routing, it just will recognize any route here. I'm gonna drop off this, and we're gonna go to the next step, because the first thing we're gonna want to do with our example here is going to be load that blog data that I was telling you about at the beginning. So I'm going to jump here to our data loading exercise, and we can kind of see what's going on here. Okay, so what has changed for this one? VS Code going to refresh for me. All right, a second. What's going on? Oh yeah, of course. Sorry, I'm just getting ahead of myself. Sorry. For our data loading exercise, we're actually just going to mainly just update that index.marko that we were just looking at. Essentially, this almost all the content that we need to do updates happens in this one file, although we completely gutted it. And I'm going to go over what each part is. This is essentially the first step here into what we're doing. The layout and the rest of this hasn't really changed at all. So what we're going to do here is take a look at what's been added. And I'm going to actually show the final results here first, just so you can understand what we're building for, help visualize it. And what that is we have now updated our example to basically show a list of blog posts. There is a title, there's a header, there's a title, there is some extra information, including coffee cups for how long the read is, and then there's a caption for the article. These are links, but they don't go anywhere yet. We'll get to there, but essentially, this is kind of just, we're just getting this listing and we're pulling it from our KV. I'm going to show you how to do this, right? First of all, we've kind of blown out our main container to include a header, and we add an image. And this image I just pulled off Twitter, I think, for Marko. But it could be really any image source. And there's a link here. And we've also added a bunch of styles to the bottom for our specific page here. But the most interesting part is that await tag that I was talking about. And what we're doing is at the top of the file, we're defining a promise or an async function, which awaits our storage here. And I've set up KV so that there's basically a posts object or post key, and then there's a post ID key where we get the comments from. We'll see that a bit later. But essentially, we're just grabbing all the posts with type JSON from the KV storage, and then we're reversing it. If we were doing real pagination or like real database, we'd be doing something much more advanced here. But you can picture this is where you could just put your request directly to your database. And because Marko's isomorphism and the way the await tag works, this code doesn't ship to the browser. This is always, this code always runs on the server. We just go await, and we call our promise, and then while it's loading, we show a loading indicator, and then when it completes, we get our data, which is our list of posts. We use a for, which I showed before. For each data, we get a post, right? And then there's going to be a list item for each, and then we have a H3 header with a link based on the post ID, the post title, and we format the date like we showed, and then we actually use a for loop again over a range from 0. So this is what I was talking about. For has a few different versions. This version, we can go from 0 to post duration 0 out of 5 to know how many coffees to show. I just got a little ASCII character here, essentially, and then we can put our post duration in. And this format date I wanted to show is just a JavaScript thing. We can use ES module imports in here. We made a utils down here, and it just abstracts that. So you can just pull any JavaScript you want into your Marko file and just run it. So essentially,
just one quick question on this end. Basically, this get posts function that we have in the Marko file, we could also move it into a JavaScript file, right?
That is correct. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the key part about this is, which we haven't showed yet, is this static keyword. And this is a new one, but essentially, because Marko files are single file components, most of the code in here, other than like the import here and the static, are stuff that's per instance. Like you could almost view, if you were thinking like React component, stuff that's like inside the component function, things that run for every instance. Whereas static is a way of hoisting out stuff that's created once for module scope. Like if I was to go static console.log hello or something, what should happen is you'll see hello here on the server. We shouldn't see hello on the client because this component never needs to send to the client. It doesn't have a class, which we'll talk about a bit later. It's just server rendered essentially. And every time we refresh this, you see a flicker here. This is not how it actually looks in production. It's because Vite lazy loads the CSS from the JavaScript after the page loads. So you always have a flash of content in dev. It's just the way Vite works. For your actual page, you'll never see a flicker like that, and I'll show that a bit later. Essentially, this hello only got printed once, no matter how many times we refreshed. Well, if I change this to a $, which is our other one, we see our hello once. Again, this component never comes to the client, so we don't see it. But every time I refresh the page, hello, hello, hello. So this is just conceptually the difference here between the code that runs like once, like a module scope, or runs on each instance. So static keyword is very powerful. we'll see the $ again later. But essentially, this is kind of, this could be imported. Anything imported is obviously module scope, so it's static as well, essentially from that definition. But this can be anywhere, and we can hit the database, and it gets split out automatically. And the main part about this is it's because there's nothing stateful here, nothing changes, so there's no need to send any JavaScript to the browser for this. We just kind of just built our HTML, put in our await, and then you know, displayed some data here. So this is do let me know if there's any questions anyone has so far, but this is kind of like the basic experience, right? Get a promise, feed into await, show loading states. And as I said, this loads so fast you can't see it, but Marko uses something called streaming. So if you know, it allows us to actually show the loading state if it's taking a long time on the data request. And I might showcase that off a bit later, but for our cases, this is all very performant and fairly easy to author. It's just doing kind of just HTML interpolation like you'd find in most templating languages. So I'm going to just move on to the next the next stage of our example, because this is the basic data loading is as easy as making a function and passing the promise to an await tag. The next step we're going to actually do is creating content. I'm going to make a new page, kind of like what I showed a minute ago with the /about, and we're going to actually use forms to actually add new content. So let's go here. So index for this change didn't change very much. What I did do was I added a new nav at the top to go to create, and I'm going to show what this looks like here. So now close our dev server. Okay, so now there's this create on the side, and when we go to create, it takes us to a new page where we have a form where we can just put some fields. To be fair, this is very basic. I'm not supporting Markdown or rich text editing at this. I just want to kind of show the basics of how you can basically mutate data in an MPA. And the most basic way, which we'll do a more advanced client-side version in a minute. But the most basic way is just putting a form on the page. And our create page is mostly that. I'm going to skip past the top of the file for a minute and kind of but essentially you kind of draw our header, and then we have a form, method post, action /create, and we have some input fields, and we're actually using just some browser has a certain amount of validation. Obviously you might want to use a client validation library if you have higher restrictions, but the browser does have minimum length and required and a bunch of that. And I just, for the simplicity for this blog, I just literally just said that these fields are required, set a minimum length, and then we set up a button. And that's really all you need. In the same way that we can just use anchors to navigate, we can just use forms to update. And again, we added some new styles, not a big deal. But if we go here, you can see if I try and create this post before it's ready, the browser has some built-in validation. I'm not going to say it's amazing or anything, but you can see it doing its thing. The more interesting part about this is with this template, we have a method for setting actions. See, this action goes to /create, and we're actually already on the /create page. So the way we define that is our templates can export these async function actions. This is something that's built into this vCloudflare template. Not every project has that, but the router earlier actually looks for actions and handles this for us. And this is super powerful because these actions happen on the server, and you can basically write all your logic in here. So in this case, we get a request. And this is the actual browser request, and we can pull the form data off of it. And I'm doing this. I could use promise all here, but essentially I'm grabbing the posts from the KV and the form data, and then I'm awaiting them. So the reason I'm initializing the promises first is so I can do it in parallel. Promise all would do this as well, but essentially I'm grabbing the promises, I'm awaiting them, getting the form data and and the data from the KV. And then all we're doing is we're going through the form data, pulling off these fields. And these fields are the names of our input fields. And then we're just pushing a new entry with this data into our KV and then putting it up, stringifying it as JSON. And then finally, we redirect back to the main page. So when we're done posting, we're going to see the listing again. And this is all handled in this action. And this is my little secret for how we get the duration. I've read somewhere that a person can generally read 1,500 characters a minute. So I'm just taking the text length, dividing it by 1,500, kind of rounding up sort of with +1. And that's how we're getting our faux duration to display those coffee cups. And this is, we've got some date formatting and whatnot. So this is kind of the process here. Response redirect are things built into the response object, the standard response object built into the web platform. And we can just take this standard request object and essentially have what we need to respond. So when we hit this create endpoint, it hits this action, as I said, pulls the form data, updates our KV, and redirects back to the list. So if everything works well, I should be able to make a new post. This post is pretty cool. Learn all about Marko JS, and yeah, and then obviously the body of our content. This stuff is all new and interesting. I'm making something. I need to get to 30 characters. Hopefully that is. Hope you are learning stuff. Okay, cool. And then we create our post, and now it shows up on our list. It did the post, did the redirect, and now we have it. And when we refresh the page, it is there. So yeah, so that's essentially how we would do a form post with Marko. And this is all server side. So far, nothing we've done so far requires any JavaScript in the browser. But that is going to change as we move into our next step of the tutorial. The next step is we want to actually display these posts because, well, that isn't great. And the way we do that is through adding, what's the URL? Posts. I'm going to add a post folder because I'm basically recreating the URL here, right? For these ones, I'm going to posts and then ID. So what we can do is we can make a file with a wildcard, essentially. And in our case, I'm going to call it ID, but this will do post / wildcard and match on that. And when we add this, now we can do something. I think, I'm get our buddy H1 to kind of show you what we can do here. But our input, I talked about this briefly at the very beginning when we were talking about layouts. Marko doesn't have props; it has input, and we should be able to here have input dot params. This is coming from the router dot ID, which is the name of this segment here. And we should, if everything goes right, now have just display the name or the number of the blog post when we go to it. This is basically how you add dynamic routes. So we're going to use this in the next step of the tutorial as a way of showing our post page, but we're going to do a little bit more with it. This is the biggest step. I'll tell everyone right now, because essentially we're going to build this whole page up, and this page is going to consist of not only displaying the individual post, but also add the ability to add comments. So we're going to get started on that right here. Okay.
But before you get into this, maybe just one more question. You were saying earlier that all of this JavaScript code is essentially executed on the server side exclusively right now.
Yeah.
Does it mean if we now look up the network activities in Chrome or Safari or whatever, we won't see any JavaScript code at all?
Yeah, let me see if I can show that the best way possible. Because the trickiest thing is maybe dev mode isn't the best. Because the problem with dev mode is we're going to see Vite pulling stuff in. See, Vite is actually pulling in some JavaScript here. And I think, let me see if I can get a production build here. Because what the funny thing is the Vite JavaScript you see here is basically nothing. Like there's no component, like there's some CSS. See, there's CSS, the lazy CSS I was talking about. But there's literally no, it's all CSS. There's no component code here, even in Vite. But let me see if I can. Let me see if I can get the. If there is, we've had some, as new versions of Vite came out, we've seen this kind of regress a couple times. But I'm going to use Wrangler Dev, which is how Cloudflare makes like a preview, and I'm going to see if I can show what I'm talking about, because sometimes we've had regressions here, but like, beautiful. This, in theory, should give me no JavaScript. Interesting. Module preload polyfill. I wonder where that's coming from. Maybe this is what Vite added. You can tell this is not like our app.
Stuff, yeah.
It's
and
not,
also, I guess
it's like someone's including a polyfill somewhere, probably Vite. This wasn't here before, but essentially none of our app code loads. Like this has nothing to do with, like, there's no component code. There's no, yeah.
And I guess also you can see how it's no longer flickering if you refresh. Right? It was
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we should be able to see. I mean, we don't actually maybe creates a better example. See, yeah. And when you refresh, there's no flicker. Yeah. So, yeah, this is funny. I'm wondering where, but generally speaking, yeah, we're not shipping our JavaScript app to the site. And we can see this here. We're gonna play with this a bit more, but I mean, one thing that we can show right now before we move on, just for emphasis, is like if I do something like this and go disable JavaScript. See, now the browser has no JavaScript. This page is still the same, right? Nothing has changed here. And when we go create, and let's do this again. This one's actually going to be on the KB, so this will stick around for a little bit on our preview, but new Marko article. Does this actually work? John Smith. This is just some text to fill up the space while we are testing this. And actually, let's actually add this a bunch of times so that we can maybe get a longer read. Like, all right. See if we can get 2 minutes read. It takes a decent amount of text to get 2 or 3 minute read, but let's see if we get there. Okay, if I create this, JavaScript's turned off, remember? Like this still all works, which shouldn't be surprising, but we'll come back to this in a, sorry, wrong one. This one, yeah. We'll come back to this in a few minutes after the next step. I'm going to enable JavaScript again. Okay, cool. So does that answer any questions?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Yeah, I hope that kind of emphasizes the power here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to undo this so I can pull to our next version, which we are now jumping to step 4. Yeah, if you're wondering why I keep on stash reply, it's because I have a custom version of my Wrangler with my own Wrangler codes. There's steps in the README about how to set up your Wrangler. We'll get there a bit, but that's why I keep on doing that as a jump. Okay, so this is the biggest step our tutorial. Moving to step 4 here, and I'm going to close a few of these extras down. It looks like my MacBook is starting to get the turbo on the fans. So let's turn that off. We don't need to be previewing that anymore. Okay, so what I've done here since we last did, there's a few new files here. There's this comments.js, which we'll talk about in a minute, but mostly I've added the posts and the ID Marko like we were just talking about. And in this example, we're actually going to grab the posts and the comments for that post. So essentially, I've defined 2 more of these static getter functions, and they're just grabbing from KV like we've seen to this point. They're just awaiting on the storage object. And as I said, this could be a database or anything that you picture on that. And then we're actually using the $ instances as a way of basically grabbing that ID. I'm kind of coercing it into a number. You notice there's no try catch blocks and stuff here. I'm sorry, the error handling could be handled nicer. This is mostly to keep this example short for demonstration purposes, but you can literally do whatever you want in these functions, or they just run on the server. But essentially, I'm triggering the promises first here, right? Get post, get comment promise. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're going to nest await tags. And I don't want to wait for this to finish before fetching this. So essentially, we trigger both promises in parallel up here. And then for the view, we await the promises to complete. And each of these, again, has some loading state. And then it has the then. And what we're doing is we're taking the data from the post, and we're going to use it to show kind of like the main article. And this text, you notice it's an exclamation mark. This is because I'm dangerously inserting HTML, so to speak, if you're familiar with React. But in a real service, you would have been sanitizing the markup and doing all that. But for our cases, we have not. So just throwing that out here. And then once we get our comments, which I'll show in a minute, we actually show a comments component where we pass the current post ID and the list of comments. And let's actually just npm run dev this so that we can kind of see what I'm talking about. So now on this step, when we get in here and we click on one of these articles, this one's a long one. Maybe I'll look at this one first, look at Marko, 6-minute read. Back in dev mode, lovely flicker. We actually see the contents of our post, right? This is what we're showing: the title, so description, some format, date, and then this is just showing them the markdown as it's been converted to HTML. And this one's funny because it's actually a blog post about writing a simpler version of this blog. So this is actually an image that looks like what we're doing. But essentially, we show our article to the end, and then we have this ability at the bottom to add comments, and the comments will list underneath here. Now I'm going to show you what that looks like. This still all only runs on the server. And this is why we split this post comments into a separate one, because this will be our first stateful component. And I actually put a components folder under posts instead of putting it here. If I put it here, it'd be accessible everywhere, and maybe that's what you want. But this kind of lets you organize code in such a way that this post comment's only visible from stuff inside this tree. So like posts, so this page can see it, but nowhere else can see it. So it helps keep the code kind of more organized for completions and kind of modularity. But our post comments is going to be our first component that actually runs in the browser. And the reason we know it runs in the browser is because it has a class. And this class is fairly simple. We set some internal state from the input that comes in, which is the comments we passed in. And then when we submit the form, we're going to do some actions. And I'm going to show you down here what this looks like. So we just took a form, post / comments, and then we created our submit event handler. And as I showed before, it's on dash this, the name of the event handler, which is this one. And the rest of this is just another form again, some required fields. I use a hidden field to pass in the ID. This is classic trick for HTML if you want to pass in data into the form. And underneath, we actually have a list. So we take that state of comments or an empty array, and we iterate over them, format them, and show some display of the comments. Yeah, there's a question about the routing. This routing pattern is actually handled completely. Essentially, Vite has this glob import ability, so we can match on a pattern. And when it goes to actually build it, it actually statically unwinds the assets that are imported. And you like basically, it knows what patterns to match. So it's Vite that actually builds this for us. And then when we deploy it to Cloudflare, it's already there. Basically, it like knows the dynamic patterns to match against. Yeah. So that's from the router here. So back to our post comments. The actual submit is what you'd expect. You prevent the default action, and then we fetch against comments using JSON. And this is a little trick. You can take the form data and use URL search parameters, and it encodes it. And then we get the response, which will be the new comment coming back, and then we add it to the end of the list. And then Marko components are event mitters. So once this state update tells Marko to automatically update. So by just doing assignments in Marko, it's like a set state. It updates kind of reactively. And this is like, once we're done updating, scroll to the bottom of the page. So this way we can show the new comment essentially. So the idea here is that you might be like, why are we using a form? Well, this is to keep things progressively enhanced. So when you have JavaScript, we prevent the default and we do our own fetch request JSON endpoint, and then we scroll and have this nicer behavior. When JavaScript's turned off, we just do a form post against comments, and it works just like what we were showing for the create before. And you might be going, well, where's /comments in this? Well, that's why we have this comments.js in Pages. Pages looks mostly for Marko files, but it can also be any JS file, and the JS file can export an action, kind of like what we saw before with our create, right? So again, it's the same game. We get our form data, and essentially we use this form data to pull something from the KV. We get the ID from there, and then we create our new comment. If initialize the array if it doesn't exist, push the new comment on, put it on. And then this is where the more interesting part comes in, because if we get a header that tells it the browser is looking for HTML, so like, is JavaScript turned off? Then what we know to do is actually do a full redirect to the refer, like the page that sent it. So this will basically tell it to reload the page and redraw the page from the server if there's no JavaScript. But otherwise, when we do our fetch request with JavaScript, we just respond with the new JSON for our new comment with a status of 200. So by adding this simple check of the headers, we can actually determine whether the page was initialized with posting a form or with using our fetch. And in so it actually works both ways, whether there's JavaScript turned on or turned off. And this all just uses built-in mechanisms of the platform. So essentially, I kind of already showed it a bit here, is that our post component essentially can add our comments and to the existing list with that JSON, but otherwise it can work. And I'm going to show you actually right now how it works both ways. Again, I'm going to get out of dev mode, because in order for me to turn off JavaScript and have it not completely die on us, I'm going to use Wrangler dev here, so we can kind of see this working. Okay. So yeah, great. So we already saw this new Marko article. So we're gonna go into our new Marko article, which now should have all the text that we were to fill up the space. Remember this. And now I'm gonna open the browser so you can kind of see this. with JavaScript enabled, what we can do is this is really interesting stuff. We can just do a post, and what you're going to see is that the page is not going to refresh. It's going to just, I'm just going to get down here somewhere. Yeah. So here's our article, and then what we're going to see is we're going to see this comment UL kind of fill out, and the page scroll to it. So I'm going to press submit, and as you see, the UL filled out. We scroll down, and this all happened on the browser without refreshing any pages, and we got our new comment, right? And when we refresh the page, you know, it's still there. Now, if, sorry, keep on pressing the wrong shortcut, sorry. Where's it? Sources. If we go like this, or sorry, like this, and we go JavaScript, disable JavaScript. Obviously, again, we refresh the page, no big deal. But if sure this works, what we will get is we'll get the page. We can still submit this even though there's no JavaScript right now. And what'll happen, yes, the whole page reloaded. And what should have happened, let's see, it's interesting. Did that not submit properly? It's interesting. Interesting. I don't know why it didn't work the first time. Maybe I didn't press the right thing. Sorry. Maybe I pressed reload without submitting. But anyways, it worked the second time. Essentially, with our JavaScript disabled right now, we actually, when we post the form, I'm going to try one more time because that's just weird. Submit. Yeah, it's there. We see our new post, and this all worked without JavaScript having been loaded or loaded yet. One thing is I had to scroll myself because I'm not using JavaScript. Technically speaking, Dylan, who works on the marketing, pointed out to me that we could have redirected to an anchor, like using like hash, and we could have actually redirected to the bottom of the page anyways, even without JavaScript. So there is quite a bit of capability you can do even with JavaScript turned off in this scenario. So it works both ways, and that's the beautiful thing about progressive enhancement. I'm going to enable JavaScript again, but I always get this messed up. It's JavaScript. Yeah, enable JavaScript. And this all works pretty well. This is, you know, you might be going, okay, well, there we go. No, that was pretty easy. Now we have client side data mutation. We have server side data mutation. We're doing, you know, the smart thing where we do as much as possible on the server. You know, where can we go from here? And I wanted to point out that while this is the basis for Marko and, you know, the kind of performance, we can use the knowledge of Marko to actually optimize things a little bit further. And that's really the last step here. And essentially, this, as I mentioned before, and I'm going to show this here, Marko doesn't need really any JavaScript to show these pages, right? Like there's just no need for any JavaScript here. But when we get into this one, because there is JavaScript here, you'll see now that there's a script tag. And it's very common when you do SSR, that we actually have all the comments encoded here. Author John Smith, this is really interesting. Author Jason Bourne, FDSF, and GG. We encoded all the JSON so we could hydrate these components. And no matter what framework you use, you've seen this before. It's essentially that I call this the double data problem, where we have essentially the content of these comments down here in this list, like here, and we also pass it as JSON data down at the bottom here. And if you think for a moment, it might occur to you that this stuff actually isn't interactive. I mean, it could be in some future, but right now, for my purpose here, this stuff isn't interactive. We don't actually need this data. Like, why are we hydrating this? And the reason we're hydrating this and we're passing the data is because Well, we told Marko to. We put it all in a class. But the truth of the matter is the only stuff that needs to be stateful, if you think about it for a second, are the new comments like we add on the page, like when we add them, right? The existing comment list, without the ability to delete here, never changes. And I want to kind of show you this trick, which is kind of the last piece, and it kind of unlocks, last bit of performance. We're looking at ways to do this automatically with the compiler for you when we get into Marko 6. But today, this is a big part of understanding kind of the power of Marko, is that essentially, if we rearrange our code here, we can save ourselves from serializing this data or even hydrating these components. And that's what this next step is about. So yeah, let me see here. Yeah, we're good. I'm gonna fast forward to our final step here, the tutorial, and go to hydration optimization. Okay. And this step isn't. Yeah, thanks, Asha, for the instruction. This step does rearrange the stuff a little bit, and I'll kind of show where the changes are. The biggest change that we make, though, is here. Before, if you remember, we were passing, and actually I can just go undo and you can see it. We were passing post comments, and we passed the ID and the comments to it, and then it was responsible for rendering the child comments in the list, and it was adding the new comments. But what I've done here is I've made the comment listing into its own component and passed it in as children. And this little trick is very powerful because Marko's compiler can tell that these children don't depend on any data from this child component, right? There's no, what do we call it, tag parameters or like render prop equivalent. So Marko knows that this can be rendered completely independently of this, and hence, so this component comment list that I made here that just makes a list of comments, there's no class in it. So it's not stateful, which means that it can be rendered on the server. So we can actually render the comments on the server using this mechanism. And what's cool about this is this component here, which, when under a server tree, essentially renders on the server, can also be used in the client. So we can actually, if you're familiar with React server components, which are brand new, so you might not be, this is technically a shared component because it actually can work both on to render the list from the server and render the list from the client. To be clear, they were always rendered on the server. This makes them only render on the server. Yes, that is true. Yeah, we were always rendering it and then hydrating. But if we do it this way and pull it out, essentially now they render on the server, but because we know we don't have to hydrate them because they never re-render in the client. There's no potential of them re-rendering in the client. So essentially, sorry, getting back here, our class component here is still our class component, but now inside the list, we pass in the parent list. So this is going to be the old comments that are just rendered in to this slot here, essentially. And then we use the same component here to render just the new comments after them. And what this lets us do is just skip on doing any processing on the old comments. And the changes to do this weren't actually that extreme. Instead of initializing the state to the input comments, we just create a new empty comments array. And then after we do our fetch, we add the new comment to the end of this new comments array. And again, if we have JavaScript disabled, none of this matters because it's always going to be old comments, because when you redraw the page, you're essentially just going to redraw everything from the server. But on the client side, we can still add new comments dynamically without reloading the page, without having to hydrate the existing comments. And that's really kind of the powerful thing here. Yeah, I'm just going to show you quickly how this works. As I said, it was a simple refactor. If you use React or similar libraries, you might have seen this sort of state hoisting as a way of preventing the need to use like memos to kind of prevent re-renders of your component. This is the same mentality here. By being able to hoist out the static view, we don't have to cause re-renders of it. And Yeah, I'm just going to go npm run dev. Actually, I'm actually going to use Wrangler for this one because it's more emphasized with a production build. I'm going to Wrangler dev here. Yeah, so let me show what this does. So yeah, we've seen this and we saw the data serialization. Now that we've deployed a new version, what's going to happen is when we refresh this page, the existing comments are there and we can see them. However, the script tag, it has some stuff. It has literally just this thing which tells it to pass the post ID into the comments for hydration. We're no longer serializing or hydrating any of these existing comments. They're treated as static. And yes, we can still add another comment. And this still works. This will still, do it and scroll down to the bottom. But essentially, we don't have to hydrate or serialize the data for any of those comments. And this might not immediately seem obvious why this is so powerful, but by just simply making these sort of changes, you can drastically save on your data serialization costs. And you can do all sorts of things with this kind of transclusion. I'm just going to pull up something here. I love Hacker News, and just kind of show you what I'm talking about, because if you've ever been or seen sort of a Hacker News demo, this one here has this ability to collapse comments, right? But there's a lot of comment data on this page, like a lot. And the thing is, if you go into Marko, there is still a lot of, because these are nested, hierarchical, there is still some stuff we have to say that like this is the entry point to each of these, hydratable island sections per se, but we don't actually serialize. If you look here, none of this data is serialized. Whereas pretty much in any framework that doesn't support partial hydration, and that's basically every framework, we don't see the same sort of, like, we have to serialize the data, right? Like if we took a React framework, sorry, did I screwed that one up? Sorry, let me get the link. 2 seconds. Oh, right, it's the other way around. Remix Hacker News. If we took sorry. If we took like a React app and did the same thing, like regardless of what our best intentions were, we end up with a giant script tag that essentially, let me see where it is. I might not be able to see, they might remove it. A lot of apps remove it, but I can probably show it over the network. Document. We're going to pull in a bunch of JavaScript here. Response. And there's really no way to avoid it. Yeah. Action data. This data here at the end is just all the serialized comment data for the whole thing. Actually, sorry, let me format it a bit better. The HTML is huge as it is, but essentially, if I can get this to, there we go, get all the way down to the bottom, you can see all the data serialization, data, right? So we render the view in HTML and we render the data. This savings can actually be really considerable. And I just wanted to emphasize this. Partial hydration isn't just about saving execution time. It's about saving size and space, to the point that, like, I just grabbed a random story off the front page here of Hacker News, and you can already see just from like the thing that, like, the whole bundle page size consideration. Where's the doc? Are we looking even at the same story? I can't even tell. Yeah, I'm not even 222. I'm not even looking at the same story. Just let's look at the same story. Yeah, I mean, 40 kilobytes. Yeah, so it saves like 25% of the page size, saves the execution costs, and basically it can have really profound effects on performance. Just to kind of nail this point in, and really all it takes is this sort of tinkering of pulling the static stuff out and keeping the class components wrapping things, right? Yeah, I mean, this is one of those unique properties of Marko that you don't find elsewhere. So it's why I sometimes feel the need to express it. I actually took one of these Hacker News examples a while ago. I found there was one that was just stupid that had like 1,400 points of comments, and this is a stupid, because honestly, you should, you know, if you find yourself in this position where you have 1,400 comments or something, like break it up, you know, load it incrementally. But I just wanted to point out that, like, if your data sources are large or they're slow, you know, there can be extreme differences on performance on the exact same app deployed to the exact same place, deployed to with the exact same APIs and stuff, right? This was a really silly example, but I just took React app with Remix and with Marko, and the gray is when it's done hydrating. So like, this is literally just the, like, as I said, the exact same setup, and purely from, well, not purely, streaming and partial hydration allows a significant difference in performance when you have these slow or large data sources, because Marko can consistently load and hydrate faster. So just, as I said, I'm just doubling down on this message just so you can understand. And I wanted to show just how easy it is to add this to this kind of capability to your own app, because Marko, you're already getting a lot of this for free anyways, just by authoring it this way. But, you know, in the few places where you can be a little smart, you can actually make reasonably big savings. And I think that's the kind of the last lesson here, in terms of how we can, you know, optimize our Marko apps. I mean, there's other technologies here that are really cool that are automatically happening for you too, like streaming. Like, I don't have really good loading states, but you saw that we were making those loading placeholders. It can make a difference, you know, usually on faster networks, but on faster networks, we can actually start showing like loading indicators before we actually load all the content. So it doesn't, you don't get blocked. And the wait tag and Marko just do this for you automatically. I didn't really want to focus on it during this thing, is because essentially progressive enhancement, streaming, partial hydration, all just come for free mostly, except for that last step where we did this kind of optimization. You just wrote some HTML, added some state-based code, and essentially that's the developer experience, right? You do have to be a little aware of client versus server when you get around to optimizing, but for the most part, you're just writing some HTML and adding some stateful logic as you need it, and that's kind of the approach, and that's how developing with Marko is. That is what I wanted to cover today. And so you got a link to the repo, you can follow along, you can do all this stuff. I have a moment now if anyone has any more questions. But other than that, that's our presentation for today.
I think to see if there are any questions at this point already. Thanks a lot, Ryan. It was super interesting. And I guess maybe you want to share your Twitter handle as well in the chat, maybe the Marko website one more time. And there's a question if there's any particular VS Code extension for Marko that you can recommend.
Yeah, we have an official one. No, I'll add Marko in here too, at Marko Dev Team.
There it is.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. Yeah. Yeah, we maintain that one ourselves. So yeah, definitely. And you can always get, Marko has a CLI for getting started. I kind of show you this here, our docs, but you can't, where is it installing? you can basically, oh, that's not even the nicest version of the instructions, but yeah, you can go mpx Marko at create. You can also go mp and init at Marko, and it'll, there's a whole bunch of templates that are available, including the basis for the one that we just did here for the tutorial. Let me see if I can pull up the examples repo. Looks like it hasn't been updated terribly recently, but I probably should just search. Yeah, here it is. Essentially, there's a whole bunch of examples. Color picker languages. We have something called Marko Serve that does most of them, which is the Webpack basis. But you'll see these new Vite ones that are actually all really nice. Like we have our Hacker News example as an example that I've showcasing. We have, you know, just standard Cloudflare. We have Fastify, HTTP, Vite Express. I think these Vite templates are the future. We're probably going to incorporate them into more things. So I would start with one of these Vite templates. But we have some classic examples too, like to do MVC and whatnot. So, and this is all reachable from the CLI. You just go npm init at Marko, and you can just choose from a list of templates to get started on your projects. Since Marko uses React, I assume Marko does not use virtual DOM, which means no DOM reconciliation. Marko today does use a virtual DOM. I guess it's kind of similar to kind of Vue in that sense. Although Vue, I would say the reactivity in Marko today is actually, it's more of just an ease of syntax thing. We still, like, instead of you having to call set state, you can just update variables directly. But generally speaking, it's still very component based, rather than kind of being like fine grained or portable reactivity. Marko 6 does change that. And we are moving away from a VDOM to do even better performance. And we get this granularity partially by using things like our new tags API, which are kind of similar to hooks, which give us this ability to kind of break things into smaller pieces than components. But for today, it is a VDOM. So just to know that it's more of an implementation detail though, because being a compiler, we have control over how we output our stuff, right? It's a VDOM in the client, but on the server, Marko's rendering is very performant because we actually just compile everything into string concatenation. It actually is a completely different output format, which makes it actually drastically faster than most other JavaScript frameworks for server rendering, even before you forget about things like out of order stream. You know, think about things like out of order streaming or partial hydration. It's just the raw, how fast you can jam strings together. It's going to be faster when you're not trying to virtualize the DOM. I wonder if progressively enhanced forms are worth the extra effort because now testers have to test everything twice with JS enabled and disabled. Yeah, I mean, it's a question. I think we should try and move towards a progressive web, probably, like the same way accessibility is important. It's a different type of accessibility. Like, it's just, and there are certain types of sites, like government sites and whatnot, you know, like you need this kind of thing. It has to always be available. I do agree that it's like, in some ways, it's, if you're coming from like using a lot of single page apps and you have these nice libraries for data fetching, it feels like you're kind of adding this extra layer. But if you actually view this from like a forms first perception, it isn't that much extra JavaScript to get the functionality there. And we're going to see this is kind of an area that a lot of frameworks are getting really into and interested in recently. Two come to mind is both SvelteKit and Remix, and they are both betting very heavily on this forms progressive enhancement thing. They try and build it in, and they're like, this is how you build web apps. And generally speaking, we've always felt that way on the Marko side, just because, you know, being multi-page app, like you're kind of already innately in that zone. Where you're, you know, doing these kind of page reload scenarios. So it made a lot of sense for us to build on top of that. But what you're going to see actually is over the next you know, year or two, I expect this to be kind of a in vogue fashion to get back into using forms, right? As both SvelteKit and Remix for React are very popular new approaches that people are looking into. Right.
Any more questions?